Christie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to
Yeah.
be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, out of your Colorado day. I mean, it looks like you're outside
Yeah,
getting
I didn't
after it.
realize we were doing video. I've got my Carhartts on and my ski hat, and I'm stoking the wood fire here. So it's quite cold here today. Coldest day of the year, actually, so far.
Oh my gosh. Well,
Yeah,
I have to say, I mean, the wood fire sounds great, but I'm enjoying not being frozen over
I
here in
bet.
Washington,
I
D.C.
bet.
So
It's not good weather for bicycling, I'll tell you that.
that's right. Well, I just want to dive right in because you wrote here, it's called Good to Go. And in there, you talk about the latest and greatest on all things recovery and a little bit more, which we'll get into. But I want to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so there's a couple of answers to that. The first is just that I was an elite athlete for a lot of my life. I'm not anymore. These days I'm just sort of a recreational athlete. I don't actually like to exercise. I like to do fun stuff outside. So I just try to keep as fit as I need to be able to do the fun stuff I like to do. But I was in college, I was a runner at a Division I school. I then got injured. I started cycling and realized I really loved that. So I joined the cycling team, did that for a few years after college to really enjoy. That's something I continue. Running and cycling are things I continue to do to this day. And then I also learned to cross country ski in college. That was something I had never done before, being from New Mexico. And anyway, I loved that. And after college, actually, it was right after I finished this graduate program in journalism, I thought, I really like skiing. My husband at the time was a serious bike racer, and he was out doing stuff. And I thought, I want to do that too. So I started cross-country skiing, ended up getting on a trade team, and I did that at a pretty high level for about 8 years. But anyway, when I look back at my career, what I see is that recovery was the one thing that I never managed to master. It was really sort of my Achilles heel. It was the thing that probably kept me from reaching my full potential as an athlete. And so it's something that I kind of learned through the School of Hard Knocks. And so, there's this saying in writing that you should write the book that you want to read. And this is sort of the book I wish I had had back then, when I was in my 20s doing all of this stuff. So that's one answer to the question. But the other answer is that, so now I'm a science journalist and I do writing on all types of science, but I do a lot of writing about sports science, and I'm constantly getting press releases and things about all of these new products that are being sold with all of these scientific claims. And I thought, this stuff has really changed a lot since I was a serious athlete. And I was interested in digging in and seeing, does any of this stuff hold up? Are these scientific claims accurate? And has recovery really changed that much since I was an athlete? When I was an athlete, people sort of understood that recovery was important, but I think there was less emphasis. It was no longer something that, you spent so much time and effort doing. It was really just sort of rest. And now it's become the real extension of training itself.
Yeah. Well, that's it 100%, because I'll
Yeah.
admit, when I read this book, it affirmed what I've been doing in my coaching practice in some realm, but I also learned quite a bit along the way too, in terms of maybe implementing something a little bit differently, or communicating in different ways, of which we'll get into here in a
Yeah.
minute. But what I want to do now is kind of take a deeper dive into a few of the items, touch on some of the highlights of the book,
Sure.
and really just go for it.
Okay.
So,
Sounds good.
all right. So the first element is, and I loved how you open up the book in terms of recovery versus recovering.
Yeah.
And you talk about how recovery, so it's a noun, or it's a verb, or it's both. So tell us more
Yeah.
on that.
So I write the book that, when I was an athlete in the 90s and 2000s, recovery was a noun. It was the state of being that you hoped to attain through all of the things that you weren't doing. It was about resting and putting your feet up. But now, this is part of the impetus for the book. What I noticed is that recovery has become a verb. It's something that people are doing, and they're sort of doing it with as much gusto as they're putting towards their training itself. And as I was interviewing people for the book, I was really surprised, the first few times that it happened, when I would talk to an athlete and they would talk about doing their recovery, because back in my day, you didn't do recovery. Recovery was like not doing, right? It was like,
Yeah,
it was
totally.
the resting.
Yeah.
But now it's become something, and this, on the one hand, I think it's absolutely wonderful that people are really recognizing the importance of recovery, and that this has become a bigger part of the culture where it's like recovering is something, that's sort of considered a legitimate part of the training process. And that's important because that is absolutely true. But it has also sort of become this thing that can become, in some instances, its own set of stress and its own source of stress. So that instead of, doing like we did in my day and sleeping more, taking a nap, maybe curling up with a book like mine, people are doing all of these things, going to places, using devices, but doing things where they're sort of still moving around and there's this sort of feeling that you need to be accomplishing something. And I think that can be really counterproductive.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And you're kind of like leading into where I want to go with that is like, where does that come from? Like, in your opinion, what has led to this point where these athletes have this anxiety or fear that they're not doing enough in their recovery?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in the age of FOMO, right? Where everyone's always reporting it every time what they're doing. And so part of it is this feeling like everyone's doing this stuff. And so therefore I need to also, but I also think that there's sort of a cultural element to it. We're living in this time where people sort of have this sense that we have to always be optimizing everything. And there's this idea that there's sort of this optimized version of yourself that's just one or two weird tricks away. And if you can just find the right weird tricks, everything will be perfect. And, your life will be awesome. And, that's a nice idea, but it doesn't really pan out. And, one thing that's really interesting that I sort of concluded and came to understand after researching this book, and this was after, to say, I read probably close to 1,000 research articles, journal articles, interviewed more than 250 sources, scientists, coaches, professional athletes. And what I sort of realized after all of that is that our bodies are highly adaptable. And this idea that everything has to be absolutely perfect for you to have your peak performance, it doesn't really pan out. Like, our bodies are really capable of dealing with, sort of suboptimal conditions. I mean, I think we've all heard the stories. I remember when I was bike racing, one of my teammates had her bike stolen, and all of a sudden she didn't have a bike. And so she borrowed this like really crappy, it was a really not a great bike. And in fact, it had like, not enough gears and whatnot. And she ended up winning a race on that bike. And it wasn't because, the bike didn't make her do it, but it sort of goes to show that it's not the bike, it's all of this other stuff, and that you don't have to have absolutely everything absolutely optimized to have a good day. And that sometimes this idea that, you have to have, eaten exactly the right thing and done this particular bath and wearing the right compression garments, whatever this is, it can actually come back to bite you because, that stuff's not going to happen perfectly all the time. And so then this sort of introduces this anxiety, like, oh, I'm not prepared because I haven't done all of this. But another place that I think this idea really comes from is marketing. I mean, and that's the biggest thing.
Totally.
Conclusion that I came to is that so much of, what we think about or what we hear about recovery these days is really just marketing. It's not science. It's marketing sort of gussied up as science. I've heard it called science washing. I really like that term, where it's, taking sort of a crappy thing and, putting a veneer of science on it to make it seem more powerful or magical or effective. But we have this idea that you have to have all of these perfect things because we have these products and these companies who are putting money into the sports and they're sponsoring these athletes. And now that we have social media, now all of a sudden, you're following your favorite athletes and you see them using these products and, they're putting pictures on Instagram or they're tweeting or whatever it is that they're doing, but they're showing, oh, I'm using this stuff, and you think it's really essential. Well, the reason they're using these things is that they're getting them from the sponsors who are sort of funding the sport. And so it's a self-perpetuating thing. And so it doesn't mean just the fact that all these professionals are using it doesn't mean that it's essential or that it even has anything to do with their success. It means that those companies are sort of paying to play.
That's it. Yeah. Capitalism alive and well.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. In fact, I have a whole chapter in the book about supplements, and, I can summarize that in 2 words: don't or 3 words, don't take them. Yeah, but I have, there were multiple instances of professional athletes testing positive on doping tests because they ingested some substance through, a supplement that they took. In one case, this famous swimmer actually ingested it through a supplement that she was given by her sponsor. So the idea that you could tell what's in these things, or that, certain companies are better than others, most of those raw materials are coming from the same place, and there are real problems there. I go into it in much more detail in the book. But you really have to be careful. You don't know what you're getting, and there's just no good reason to be taking supplements in the first place.
Yeah, well, when I heard you speak at the Training Peaks Endurance Coaching Summit, I was like, we need to have Christie on this podcast, because you were able to cut through the BS and get to the essentials. And that's what I want to do right now. So I'd say let's dive into some recovery modalities or techniques that we'll touch a few that are in the book, and there's tons more in the book. So if this is striking people's interests that are listening to this, get the book. But all right, so let's just go right to it. Ice baths, they good?
So as you know, I have a whole chapter on icing, and it's called The Cold War. It's about icing and cryotherapy, which we can kind of lump together. So there are not a lot of things where I will say, do not do it, but cold and icing, ice baths and cryotherapy are ones that I will say that. The idea here is that it's supposed to help with recovery and flush out lactic acid and all this other stuff. But it turns out that icing and cryotherapy, maybe not cryotherapy specifically, but cold therapy seems to actually be detrimental to recovery, which really surprised me. That's not what I was expecting at all. I actually went into it believing that icing was a great thing. I hate doing it, but I really sort of believed in the power of it because everyone does it. I've been doing it. It hurts, so you kind of feel like, oh, it must really be working. But the evidence that we have now suggests that it actually slows the healing process. It slows adaptation. So if you're doing hard training in hopes of getting fitter, faster, stronger, you may actually be sort of blunting those gains. So I would say it's something to avoid. The exception would be, it is a very good way of numbing something. So if you've twisted your ankle and it's hurting like hell and you can't stand it, icing will make it feel better for a little while, but it's not something that's going to help the healing process.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing that has evolved very recently. And I think in your book you talked about the founder of the Rice principle actually going back and saying, hey, look, you know what, I think I got it wrong in terms of the icing component to it. And I've fallen victim too as a coach, being like, oh yeah, ice the legs down, sit in the cold river after your bike race. And sure, yeah, I think you touched on the points. It numbs, it has this endorphin release, and it has these sensations, which when there are sensations, we want to believe that there's good things happening.
That's right. That's right. And I'll say that, with icing, so there is a situation where I think it can be helpful. And that is, you're getting off of a hard bike race on a hot day when your body temperature is really elevated. So there it can be helpful just for sort of reducing your core temperature and helping you cool off. But the reason to do that is to cool off and to feel good. You don't need to stay in for 30 minutes or whatever. I mean, it's really about cooling off. It's not about aiding recovery.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I was going to actually ask you, because that is something that I do around here. Again, I've been living in DC now for a few years. It gets up to 105 degrees.
It's so humid there too. I've been there. Crazy. I try to avoid going there in the summer these days, but yeah, it's hot.
It should be avoided. But if you do make it here and ride your bike like I do, you'll want to try to cool down as quickly as possible. Yeah. And so what I've done and what I do recommend to my athletes is, taking a cold shower or a cool bath, but not an ice bath. Now, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong there. Should it be icy cold, or should it just be cool cold?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose here is really to cool you off. So that's the temperature that will do that. And I don't see that, icy cold is probably not really that superior to just a cold shower, cool water, jumping in the river, whatever it is. But I think this is a good opportunity here to get to what I think is a really important point. And that is, We tend to think of these things in absolutes, like something really works or it doesn't work, but so often it's very contextual and it's situation specific. So in general, like icing isn't something you should be doing in hopes of speeding recovery. You don't need to do those ice baths like we used to do in stage races. Like that's not actually helpful. On the other hand, there are some situations where it can be helpful. And so you have to be careful that you don't overgeneralize any particular finding. And this is particularly, I think, an issue with a lot of the sports science studies that come out. What ends up happening is someone does a very small study. I mean, it's very common for these studies to have on the order of 10 participants. And they find something oftentimes because they've fished around in the data till, they can find a positive result. That's a whole nother topic we can get to another day. But they find something that's interesting, and then all of a sudden this becomes a thing to do. Well, what has the study shown? It's shown that in those 10 athletes on that day, in that lab, under those conditions, this thing happened. But does that mean that that will be, generalizable to your situation, which could be different in 20 different ways? And I'm not saying here that we should throw out all science and all studies and we shouldn't believe them, but only that we need to have sort of a high threshold here and remember that science is really a process of uncertainty reduction. It's not something, you don't do a study and say, aha, now we understand it and we know all there is to know. And what happens so often is you have these companies and these purveyors of products and services who it's very easy, if you're looking for a particular answer, to design and carry out a study that will give you something that will be able to back that up. And so you really have to look at these studies and these things and say, okay, what are they measuring? Is it really measuring something meaningful? So they're claiming that this thing works, but what do they mean by working and what evidence do they have for this? Because so often when you take a sort of closer look at what's been done, you realize that these things are being grossly oversold based on pretty flimsy evidence.
I love that. That's beautifully said and beautifully put. And I think that if our audience can just let that soak in, or even like rewind back 30 to 60 seconds and listen to that again, I mean, let that soak in.
I begin the book with a study that I did about beer and running. I had this
beer study.
trying to answer this burning question of, is beer the perfect recovery drink? But the reason I chose to begin the book with the study is that it really shows, I hope that it walks people through this process and why, science is really awesome. It's the best way that we have to understand the world, but it also is a lot more difficult than I think most people understand. And I'm really hopeful that that chapter, if people who read it will sort of walk away with a better understanding of what studies can and can't do. And I really wanted people to be able to walk away from this book with the tools they need and sort of the background understanding they need to be able to assess studies and to be able to assess claims. So many of these recovery modalities, and this is true for training as well, are so often sold with these, this goes back to what I was saying earlier, the marketing masquerading as science. And I hope that by reading the book, people will come away with the skills and sort of, this knowledge to be able to assess this stuff and say, okay, should I believe this claim or shouldn't I, or what red flags are popping up for me here?
Yeah, exactly. Well, since we talked about the cold, let's talk about the heat now.
Yeah.
In there, you talked about infrared sauna and a few other things. So good or bad, or can we say one or the other?
So this is something that kind of goes in between. And one of the big takeaways that I come to in the book is that at its most basic level, recovery is rest, it's rejuvenation, it's relaxation. I mean, I think the relaxation part really gets lost a lot because so many of these modalities and things now are all about doing things, and you have to rush off to do the next part of your recovery process. This is the recovery as a verb. But really, relaxation is a huge part of it. It's allowing your body, to unwind and to be relieved of stress. You want to be able to, reduce to the extent possible the stress in your life, the stress on your body, because to your body, stress is stress, whether it's coming from your workout or something else. So this relaxation is a really important part. So anything that helps you relax, that's actually doing something beneficial. And so you can hear all of these claims. So infrared saunas are a great example of this. Infrared saunas are saunas that are, they basically feel a little bit cooler than a regular sauna. So if you like that, that's fine. But they're really sold with this idea that infrared heat is somehow, something magical or different. And there's a little bit of truth to this. If you remember back to your high school physics class, infrared is a particular, wavelength of light, or, we also feel this in our bodies as heat on the infrared spectrum. And so, yeah, it's a little bit different than other kinds of wavelengths, but it's, at the end of the day, it's basically heat. And so there's not a lot of big differences. And so if you like an infrared sauna and it helps you relax, that's great. If you don't like it, or you find saunas unpleasant, that it's not something to do just for its own sake. And, there are things floating around on the internet about how infrared saunas can do all sorts of magical things and reduce inflammation and markers, all these sort of things that when you look at evidence that they cite, it's very, very flimsy. I looked pretty deep into the evidence when I was working on the book and could find almost nothing that actually was, in the correct context to be applicable to athletes like this. And so, I know people that love infrared saunas, and that's great, but I don't think it's something, it's something to do because it helps you relax. It's not something to do because you think that there is something particularly special about infrared versus some other kind of heat.
Yeah, well said. Well, what about some of these other gadgets like pneumatic compression boots or sleeves?
Oh yeah, the squeezy pants. Well, can I just say, I love the squeezy pants. I would, if someone gave me a pair, I would use them, but I'm not going to spend.
I'm a big fan of squeezy pants because of the squeeziness of them. Let's just
yeah.
And it makes you relax, like you said. But what's the science say about getting squeezed in your legs?
Yeah, so these things actually came out of it began. The squeezy pants began as actually medical products for people with, say, diabetes and things, people who were having trouble with circulation. And so the idea was to prevent blood from pooling in your legs and to aid circulation. And that does work. But the thing is, if you're an athlete, circulation is not your problem. And it's going to be hard to increase circulation above sort of what it already is. I mean, you can maybe increase it a little bit, but if you're really trying to increase circulation, the thing to do is a warm down or some light exercise, right? Like that's the best way to increase your blood flow and increase circulation. So there's really nothing that's special that's happening here in terms of, there are some claims that are made about flushing lactic acid or facilitating blood flow. So the blood flow thing is true, but again, it's something that's not going to be your limiting step. So whether that actually helps you is pretty debatable. The lactic acid thing, there are so many products for recovery that claim to do things with lactic acid. And I'll just say here, there was a time when we thought that lactic acid was what made you sore. Back when I was in high school, my coach used to say, you got to rub out your legs or even do warm down, things like this, because you got to get rid of the lactic acid. Well, it turns out that lactic acid is associated with hard exercise, so you do produce it. It is something that's produced in those situations, but it's not the thing that's making you sore. And furthermore, it's something that's actually cleared very rapidly from your muscles. So by the time you're doing one of these things, that lactic acid is probably gone anyway.
Yep.
So that's not really holding up. Okay, so then are the squeezy pants effective? Well, I would argue that they are, but they're not effective because of something special they're doing with your blood. They're effective because they're making you sit down with your legs up for 30 minutes or 40 minutes to relax, and it feels really nice. And this goes back to the idea, if it helps you relax, that in itself, that's a bona fide reason. You don't need some pseudoscientific reason, slapped on top of it. Like that in and of itself is enough.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that. The one thing we add to our training camps or race experiences or things like this is massage or pneumatic compression legs. And I don't really oversell it. I just say, hey, if you can get it without adding stress, go and do it.
Yeah.
And what I love asking the athletes after that is, how'd you feel? And, I'm so relaxed. Oh, it felt so good. And it's like, perfect. That's the point. And then sometimes I ask, do you think you would have done that had you not scheduled that session or been on massage table? And they're like, no, probably not, because everybody's on their phones trying to catch up with work in between. And what I try to use these tools for now is to help bring awareness to the habits of the athletes, to take time after the race, after the hard session, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever you can, and just chill out, maybe legs up in the boots or on the table, and just get it done. But that being said, massage, I kind of talked about in your book. Anything else there for us?
Yeah. I mean, I think massage is, look, the pneumatic compression boots are really a type of massage, right? I mean, it's really kind of the same thing. Yeah, massage feels really good. This is one of the things, I mean, I think, if there's one thing that athletes sort of like best for recovery, it's probably massage. And there's a reason. It's very relaxing. But I think there are some other benefits that come from massage. When you look at the science, there's not a lot there to show that there's something really special going on sort of a molecular level with your blood or things like that. But what it is doing is helping you relax. And I think there's this sort of less tangible thing, which is it's sort of helping you get in tune with your body too. I think massage is really good for helping athletes become attuned to how they're feeling in every sort of body part. I mean, I think we've all had that experience where, the massage therapist starts railing on some muscle that you didn't realize, oh my God, that's really sore. And you hadn't realized it, or all of a sudden you realize, wow, my right calf is really sore. My left one is less so. I wonder what's going on with that. So I think it's a really good opportunity to sort of check in on how you're really feeling, what's going on in your body. And that's a harder thing to measure and to quantify, but that doesn't mean that it's less important.
Agreed. Well, I'll squeeze this one in for the last recovery modality, but how about these muscle fascia tools like scrapers, foam rollers, vibrational guns, this kind of stuff? What's your takeaway on that?
Yeah, so the science on this is pretty new. I think that we don't have really solid answers yet. Like with icing, there's been a lot of studies on this now, and I think we're sort of congealing around this consensus that it's not helpful. With the fascia stuff, there's a lot of ideas about how this works. There's some interesting findings. So one of the things that I think is most interesting is there have been a couple of studies now where they will do foam rolling on one leg but not the other, and yet the benefits seem to accrue to both of them. So that sort of suggests that, contrary to the idea that, you're smoothing out the fascia, or there's all sorts of mechanical explanations that are given for this. It seems to be more of a neurological sort of thing, and maybe you're sort of resetting pain receptors or something. This is all hypothetical. I don't think that it's really proven yet. So, there's some people who totally swear by this stuff. I don't think that we have really solid evidence yet to say how it works, if it works. I also have in the book a whole chapter on placebos, and I think that this stuff is really great placebo stuff. It has the potential. And just because something's exploiting the placebo response doesn't mean that there aren't, legitimate benefits too. And I would actually argue, and I sort of do in the book, that the placebo response is something that we should harness for good if we can. But we have evidence now that placebos that are painful are more effective than ones that are inert. So like a placebo shot works a lot better than a placebo pill. And I think that foam rollers sort of fall into that category. It's kind of painful and hurting, and people think, oh, this is really digging in there. It hurts, so it must really be doing something. And then you're sort of creating this pain, and when you stop, it goes away. So that can, in and of itself, make you feel better, right?
Yeah, no, that's it. But I'd say kind of to summarize the recovery modalities, I mean, keeping it simple and getting your rest, getting your sleep, and kind of doing less is essentially what you're saying here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it really comes down to sort of the three main factors. One is prioritize sleep. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. There's just no skimping on that. If you're not sleeping well or enough, nothing else that you're going to do is going to matter. Reducing the stress in your life is really important. Again, it's not just the stress of the training, but any other kind of stress, personal stress, psychological, life stress. If you are having a really, really hard week at work, working long hours, that is not a rest. You may not have gotten a workout in that day, but you're not resting. And I think you need to really understand that. And I think it's very helpful to think of stress in terms of a budget. Like you have a budget of how much stress your body can take and how much stress your body can recover from. And so how you spend that is not always, sometimes we have stress expenses that are put on us that we would not have chosen. That's the stressful week at work, or problems at home, whatever it is. But you have to recognize that you only have so much in the bank, and so you can't overspend. If you do, you will become overtrained. And I think that a lot of people sort of are not fully aware of sort of how these other kinds of stresses can contribute to overtraining syndrome. This is something that can happen. People think, oh, you have to be a professional athlete to be overtrained, or someone who's training, hundreds and hundreds of miles or huge numbers of hours, but it's possible to sort of have symptoms of overtraining and become overtrained if you are under recovering. And in fact, the latest thinking on this is actually that it's not so much overtraining as it is under recovering. And so you're basically giving your body more stress than it can handle, and at some point it just breaks.
Yeah, that's it. One thing that I talk with my athletes is we talk about training stress.
Yeah.
And on Training Peaks, there's a training stress score.
Mm-hmm.
And you get certain points as you accumulate time at intensity, and it makes you tired, and then you rest and it gets better. But I also talk about life stress, or I call it
Absolutely
LSS. And I just say it all goes in the same bucket.
It does.
And when that thing's overflowing, you got to take something away. And sometimes that's training. And
absolutely.
It's a very abstract way of looking at it, but some of the data we have now, athletes can conceptualize that a little bit better. And to kind of transition into that, you talk about data and metrics in your book, mm-hmm. and we live in a time period where we can measure we can measure all.
Yeah, we're all about the numbers now, right?
Yeah, heart rate variability, deep sleep, light sleep, power, pace, electrolyte composition, muscle glycogen, and all these kind of things. And then we love to put out algorithmic computations that give us recovery scores or something to tell us how to train. You went through all the data. You kind of sifted through. What'd you find?
Yeah, well, I have to preface this by saying that I'm a data journalist. Up until this past year, I was working at FiveThirtyEight, a very well-known data journalism site. So I'm all about the numbers. So I want to make that clear because, I was a little bit surprised to come to the conclusion that numbers are not where it's at for this. And what I mean by that is, there are a lot of people and there are all sorts of companies that are making a lot of oversold claims about data and recovery scores and things like this. But when you really look at this, and scientists, of course, are looking at this and they've done a lot of research on it. And there's a really interesting paper that I talk about in the book where they actually it was a meta-analysis. So they compared all these different types of factors that people were looking at. And in particular, sort of looking at different measures of training load and stress to see what's the best measure of training or of recovery and whatnot. And it turns out that the very best measure is actually mood. How are you feeling?
That's right.
Are you grumpy? Are you testy? But look, we've all experienced this, right? You're at training camp, you're training really hard. People get, some people get anxious, some people get depressed, some people get moody, whatever it is, but it manifests in these psychological ways and these mood ways. And oftentimes an athlete who is feeling who's physiologically becoming overtrained will actually feel like they don't feel like training and they're not in the mood. And that's a sign, but what that athlete will often do is sort of double down and say, what's wrong with me? I must need to train harder. Why am I feeling lazy? And it's that's actually your body saying that you need a rest and you should listen to that. And so I think the way to think about this, we have now all of these different tools. Everyone's got their tracker that can measure all sorts of things. And these things kind of go in fads. There's heart rate variability. There's, different scores that proprietary scores that different devices have. But you can think of your brain as sort of this master computer, and what it's doing is taking in all of the physiological inputs that it has, how sore your muscles are, how fatigued you are, how your sleep is, and all this. And it's putting that together in this feeling. So that feeling that you have in your mood and just sort of this, non-quantitative feeling of well-being is actually your brain putting that all together. And so we may be dismissive of it and say, well, it's not a number that you can measure on a watch. And yet it's far more sophisticated than that because it's taking in all of those things and it's considering it. And I think that that's sort of the way to think about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the first things I ask my athletes when I get them on the phone, how are you feeling today? How are the legs feeling today? That type of thing. RPE in mood states on Training Peaks, I log those. Exactly. But I'll say this too, Christie, like you, I work with data and analytics daily.
Yeah.
to measure how things are going with my athletes. So I'm not going away from data and analytics. I track and monitor performance markers. And we can talk about what performance means in a separate conversation, but let's just say a
Yeah.
performance that, we can hang our hat on. In addition to these mood markers and some of these other things, it's real noisy. I don't necessarily say, to wear the Whoop device or all these things. I think it'll be interesting to see where we go.
Yeah.
So I go ahead.
I think that I don't think that these measures are unhelpful or they're useless,
Yeah.
but I think that the danger here, and it's fine to look at them and pay attention to, but I think the most important thing here and the takeaway is that athletes need to sort of figure out what they need to pay attention to and make sure that they're paying attention to the right things. So, for instance, your feeling and your mood and your sort of sense of well-being is more important. That should trump what your heart rate variability is saying, for instance. And the problem, I think, and the issue is when people become so fixated on their data that they've lost that sense of how they're actually feeling. And it can be trickier than it sounds, because it's not just like, how are you feeling? You have to really think for a second, okay, how am I feeling? And what does that mean? So I think I'm feeling good, but does that mean my muscles aren't sore? Does it mean I'm feeling energetic? And like really sort of considering all of these things that go into that sense. And I think that this takes practice, frankly, and that it's not something that, although it's sort of a natural thing that we have, your natural mood or how you're feeling, it's sort of, it takes some time to figure out for you, what are the signs of overtraining? What are the signs that I'm not fully recovered? Because these are very individual. And again, they can be sort of context specific too. It may be that if your sleep is not going well and you're not getting enough rest, that you'll have certain symptoms or you'll notice certain things. Whereas if you are just under recovered from your last workout where your muscles just are really still feeling sore, that may feel a different way. But being able to sort of understand and learn to read those signs, that will help you also understand what you need to do about it. So I know like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit stale today. And I know because of the qualitative aspects of this feeling that that's because I haven't been sleeping well. And I also know that because I'm actually paying attention to how I'm sleeping, right? Because that's sort of the first step. Or I know that I'm feeling kind of stale, but that's because, I trained really hard the last 2 days and I just, it's not unexpected and I know that that's okay. And so I'll decide what I want to do then. Does that mean I need an easy day or does it mean that I just sort of accept that like, okay, this is okay that I'm feeling this way and there's nothing wrong. It's just, this is the state right now. And I think that it's those sorts of sensory things that athletes really need to pay attention to and take time to really learn to read for themselves.
Yeah, again, it comes back to awareness. Helping to bring awareness to athletes, I think, is something that the data and the metrics are doing right now. I think that it'll only get better in the future, but that's kind of my point too. Is there's so much out there, so don't get tripped up in all the noise of all the gadgets. And that's again what you're kind of alluding to in your book.
Well, and I think the danger here too is that you start to like. You shouldn't be asking your sports watch, how am I feeling?
For sure.
You know how you're feeling, and then it's sort of the opposite of how you should be. It's like, here's how I'm feeling, and what are my numbers? How can they help me contribute, or what are they telling me about it? The danger is when you're doing it the opposite way. And I had this really funny story was told to me. A friend of mine is a college track coach, and he was doing mile repeats with his team one day, and he kept noticing that some of the kids were running past the finish line a little bit, like they weren't stopping at the finish line. And I'm not a repeat. You're pretty much ready to stop at the finish line. Right? And he was like, guys, what the hell are you doing? Well, it turned out that the GPS, they had to go just a little bit further for the GPS watch to register the full mile. So they were doing that. And it's like, I think he made them all take their watches off at that point. But I mean, the point here is that, and I think obviously they weren't not trusting that they were actually running a mile, but they wanted to get that data into their devices and all of that. And it's like, no, you should not be like, it's not the computer stuff that's going to tell you how you're feeling or how things are going. And you need to sort of like let go of having to like control that so much or be looking at that. Like you need to develop your own sense of that. And it's just really a danger when you're offloading that to some other device and you're letting the device tell you how far you ran or whether you felt good or, you know, whether this was a hard week or an easy week.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. That's a
Yeah.
wonderful point. And I think to that end, and as long as we're talking about like what does the science say, what does the data say, I'm going to change directions just slightly, and then we're going to come around because we are running a little short on time, but I want to make sure we squeeze it all in. So for you talk about recovery meals and in a recovery window of time, and I kind of grew up in that era where 30 to 45 minutes after a hard workout, you got to get food in. Where are we at right now in the science on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And in fact, it just published today. I have a new fitness column at Elemental, which is this science vertical at medium.com. But I just published a story today on there about carbo loading, which, you know, when I was in high school, that was a huge thing. We'd all do carbo loading. And like now people don't do that, and there are good reasons for it. And you know, it's sort of, we're not doing carbo loading, and yet carbs are still really important, but things have evolved a little bit. And so the window of opportunity is another thing that's really evolved. So there was some early research that seemed to suggest that after you exercised hard, if you were to get in, and particularly carbohydrates, although later on it looked like protein was really important too, that there was, you know, 30, sometimes it was said 40 minutes, but the short window of time after the workout in which your muscles were sort of over eager to replenish, you know, the fuel stores they'd used. And so if you could get that nutrition in right away, you could sort of make sure to really, that there would be this super compensation effect. So you would be sure that your glycogen stores were really well packed and you'd be ready and good to go for the next workout. Well, it turns out, you know, they did more research, and it turned out that this was another thing where it was like context dependent, and, you know, it looked like this time was really important. That was just sort of a relic of the way they were doing the studies. And it turned out that it wasn't the timing that was so important. It was the actual nutrition itself. So it was not that you needed that protein in within 30 minutes of the workout so that you could repair your muscles. It was that you needed that protein. And in fact, now we think that it's better to be getting protein throughout the day instead of in one huge dose. You know, you still see people that are doing these huge protein shakes, particularly after strength workouts, but it just, the evidence isn't there for that anymore. So you do need that protein, but taking it in one giant meal right after exercise is not necessary, and it's probably not even ideal. It's probably better to be getting in throughout the day. And you know, the exception would be if you are doing something where you're doing one workout and then you're going to have to perform again in short order. Well, yeah, you want to refuel for that second workout. But if you're doing a workout and you're not going to train again until the next day, you know, you can wait till dinner or whatever. Now, on the other hand, this is sort of, I think this goes back to my earlier point of everyone wants it to be black and white and like you do this or you don't do this. It's like, if you finish your workout and you're hungry, like that's your body saying it needs food.
Totally.
You know, it's like, yeah, but this idea that it has to be one special thing. And in that instance too, like, you know, if you are, you know, hungry for a salty snack, that's probably telling you need some salt. So go ahead and, you know, have that pretzel or whatever. Like it's okay to obey your body's calls for nutrition.
Yeah. And as I sit here and I listen to what we're talking about, and after reading the book, I think more than anything, I think it allows the athlete to take some worry off, to take some anxiety off of everything that they're doing, especially their recovery, but everything that they're doing.
Yeah, probably the number one type of comment that I get from readers. I've been getting lots of letters from readers and tweets and things like this, direct messages. And I would say the number one response that I get is, thank you so much. I feel so relieved. You know, you've given me permission. Basically, my book gives them permission to stop worrying about all the stuff that doesn't matter. It's sort of like, I think a lot of the focus of the book is really helping people identify the things that do matter so they can stop wasting time, energy, and money on the stuff that doesn't. And frankly, day, there's a hell of a lot more stuff that doesn't matter than what does. And I like to tell people, this is your advantage over the competition. I mean, people are always saying, oh, they want to know the latest thing that everyone else is doing. But in a way, sort of letting go of this idea that there's always going to be some new thing that's better than everything else. Most of that stuff never pans out. They do the initial study, or there's some sort of hint that something's great, but it's never quite as great as it's initially advertised. And so let everyone else chase those mirages. You focus on the stuff that really matters. If you can master the fundamentals, I mean, just doing that is actually a lot harder than I think most people recognize. But that's a much better use of your time, energy, and money. And so, let your competitors chase that other stuff. They could waste all their energy on it while you're sort of doing the stuff that's much more important.
Yeah. Well, so what would you say to the person who's reading the latest article, or their training partner or their coach is telling them, hey, this is the new recovery thing? Like, what would you tell them about that next recovery thing?
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not opposed to trying new things, and I'm not going to say like never believe the new thing. I would, take some time. And there again, this is where I think my book can help. I think by the time you're done reading it, you'll have some of these tools to assess these scientific claims, but take a close look, like what is it that's being claimed? What is the evidence for it? And there's also almost just sort of, the BS test. Like, does this even make sense? Because so often, Tom Brady's magic infrared pajamas are a great example of this. It's like infrared technology, and there's, this ceramic blah, blah, blah inside the fabric. And like, I don't think you need an advanced degree in physics to be able to listen to this and know that it's kind of bogus. And so, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to sum it all up. And so I guess as we move into the final portion of this podcast, in the takeaways, really, we'll sum up some key points. But first, I want to ask you 3 questions that our audience, I think, can apply right away to their training. So the first one is, what is your go-to post-hard workout recovery food?
Yeah, I love yogurt, actually, is one of my favorite, and bananas are probably the second.
You actually mentioned those in your book, so
yeah.
it's on brand. Okay, question number 2. So we know sleep is important. We talked about it on the podcast today, but what do you recommend for athletes who have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep at night?
Yeah, I think one of my best tricks is get the clock radio out of your room, like take away the clock, stop looking at the clock. And this sounds simple. And I had a friend who was suffering from terrible insomnia, and I told her to do this, and she was really resistant. And then finally she did it, and she said, wow, that really works. So, so much of
the
this,
basics again.
yeah, but also it's sort of, you get into this cycle where you're awake and you're worried about it, and then that anxiety keeps you up. So sort of like give yourself permission to just lie there and realize that just lying there and being quiet and resting is helpful too. I'll give you, I know you only asked for one, but there's a second trick that I've used myself on occasion, and I think it really works. And that is pick a word, doesn't matter what it is. Let's say it's apple. So then you start with A, and you think of as many words as you can that start with A, and then you go to the next letter, and the 2 P's probably isn't helpful, but you get the idea. But the real purpose here is that it's turning off that churning brain, because you're thinking of something else instead of whatever it is, the anxiety that's keeping you up.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, question number 3. If you're going to invest time or money on something for recovery, what do you suggest to our listeners?
So I don't think you need to invest money, but I think that the very best thing that you can do to enhance your recovery is to really make a commitment to prioritizing sleep. And I know this sounds so basic, and people are like, yeah, sleep. The thing is, no one does this. And it's actually a lot harder, I think, than people realize, to really prioritize sleep, because the way to get sleep is to make it a priority, to make it something that you don't compromise on. And I think many of us now live in a sort of situation or lifestyle where we don't have a choice of when we're getting up. I like to sleep in, and lots of times I can. I'm lucky enough that I work from home and I can do that. I mean, this morning I slept until 8 a.m. I know a lot of people can't do that, but if you have to get up at a certain time, that really limits you. So that means you have to go to bed at a certain time if you're going to get your 8 hours of sleep, right? And so it can be really hard though when 10 o'clock rolls around and you're watching Netflix, or you decide, well, I'm just going to check email one more time. I mean, I guess I would say never check email, especially like right before bed.
For me, like I can't do that. If I check email
Yeah.
or something like that, my brain is going nonstop. So
Well, and it's also, you think it's going to be 5 minutes, but it's never 5 minutes, right?
totally, totally not.
Yeah. So really, I mean, I think really truly making a commitment to sleep and figuring out, like, for your lifestyle and for your circumstances, how can I get the sleep that I need? And what is that going to look like? I mean, for some people that might be a nap if you have a lifestyle that will allow that. For other people, it's going to bed earlier, whatever it is. But there's, it's not just something that's a given. Everyone sort of, gives it lip service, but very few people walk the talk.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is solid advice, Christy. And if I can summarize, I mean, it is prioritize sleep first and
Yes.
foremost, and make sure that you are sleeping and resting properly. Two, it would be, if you are tracking data and metrics and things like that, make sure that you're also checking in with your mood and bringing awareness to your body after hard training sessions and after sleep as well. And then finally, don't sweat the small stuff. I mean, just,
Yeah.
you don't have to bring such anxiety about your recovery habits or the food or the timing or anything like that. So, I mean, is there
Absolutely.
anything else that you would add to that summary?
I think the final thing would just be that I think it's really important to have a daily relaxation ritual. Have a time in your day that's just for you, where you don't have all these outside, distractions vying for your attention and your time. It can be kicking back with your feet up and having a beer after work. It can be, taking a hot bath. It can be, it doesn't matter what it is, but it needs to be something that you're doing on a daily basis, that is time that is set aside where you don't feel this urgency to be productive. And it's not a time where you feel like you need to be doing something, but where you're really just relaxing, however relaxation looks for you. If you have the squeezy pants, use that. That's fine. I wish I had them. I don't. Yeah. Oh, and read my book, right? It's out in
Yeah,
paperback
there
this
you go.
month.
Perfect. Well, if we wanted to read more about what you're writing now or follow you on the socials, Christy, how can we do that?
Yeah, so my book is www.goodtogobook.com. You can find ordering information there. My website is my first name, last name.com. On Twitter, I am Crag Crest, and that is the place name of my favorite trail run out here in Colorado. So it's Crag as in like craggy rocks, and Crest. Yeah, that's a good way. I take DMs too, so.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I think I think I'm good to go, and I think our audience are as well now. So thank you for taking the time today, and we'll let you get back to playing outside in Colorado.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Christy.
Bye.